Ladies, gentlemen, and travelers of all ages, with Last Epoch now being out for around 1.5 weeks, you're probably a good chunk of the way into the experience now. I'm sure many people are onto the empowered monoliths, though the average player base, at least those who started with 1.0 for the first time, are generally working their way around the base monoliths right now, scattered around from levels 50 to 70 or 80, essentially just living their best lives in the middle section of the game. A lot of people rolled a certain class to begin with and then realized it wasn't quite right for them, and a lot of people just have general interest on if the grass might be greener on the other side. So today we're going to go over something quite simple, a build that I think is fantastic for each and every mastery in the game for this mid-game to early late game stage that a lot of the player base is currently engaged with, as well as a ranking of how each mastery is performing compared to each other, at least within the same class. What's the current strongest Sentinel mastery, things like that. So without further ado then, let's start off with the Acolyte base class, my own home turf. And we do have to put Warlock at the top here. The damage that it does in general is just sort of nutty, and the general way that I've seen this achieved is by combining loads of different curses, which are essentially just Acolyte branded ailments, combining it with Chthonic Fissure for just massive patches of death on the floor, then using Ghost Flame as a heavy defensive and offensive booster, applying various debuffs and also giving you significantly more ward than you have health and making you extremely tanky quite easily as a result, while also being a channeled skill that you can cast while moving. The main thing that you really need to get this thing functioning then is the Bone Claymore Bar Boot unique. A lot of good stats on it, but most importantly is 1 ward per second per 3% uncapped necrotic resistance. Uncapped just means that it counts resistances that you have over the maximum of 75%, so you just stack a ton of necrotic resistances even past the normal maximum, and this gives you a ton of defense all on its own from the ward generation. As a whole though, Warlock is just really strong right now. Whether it is overtuned or not and will be getting a nerf or not is yet to be seen. It is definitely a complex class overall, but it may be a bit stronger than it should be in some areas long term. Second up for an Acolyte then we have the Necromancer, and I think you could very debatably say Lich might be here and Necro is third. It's sort of back and forth for different reasons. They are close to each other for different actual parts of the way they function. Because of the way the game works though, I personally lean definitely more towards Necro myself for 2 reasons. Overall, Necromancer generally does a bit less damage than Lich, not necessarily always, but it also does so from a much safer position, which I will explain when we talk about Lich, and it often does so with far less required button inputs, meaning even regardless of the build itself, you just get to place a lot more of your focus on movement and physically dodging attacks that are coming at you, rather than most of your focus being put on doing the damage yourself. As far as Necromancer builds go then, my personal favorite mid to early late game one right now is one that I've been running for a fair bit of my time since 1.0, and it is a Wraithlord's Harbor build, based around just boosting the hell out of the Wraithlord from this unique until he is just stronger than most players will ever be, and then I just get to run around staying alive while he absolutely destroys everything for me. And I do just love the experimental boots affix that I've got too that makes minions teleport to you when using a traversal skill as well. That is just an absolute game changer, and of course we do have this full build guide for this one up on the channel already if you want to check it out. And while this build mostly focuses around the power of a singular large minion, don't worry, if you like having lots of minions at the same time, there are tons of good Necromancer builds with that as a focus too. Then in my final Acolyte slot, we do of course have the Lich. This class is thematically totally badass, with the main skill being Reaper Form, which transforms you into an embodiment of death itself, swinging your scythes around and getting tons of bonuses and buffs while in this state, while in Reaper Form your health is constantly draining. If it hits 0, you drop out of the form and turn into a weak little Acolyte that will probably wind up getting you killed if you're in melee range of most things. That said, even as base mechanics, the Lich does more damage the lower its health is, so it sort of incentivizes that kind of risk and reward gameplay, emphasized heavily by Death Seal as well, which locks your health at its current number. It can still actually go down from there, but it can't go above the number. It also gives you a further damage and damage reduction buff based on how risky you actually get with it, and that's the main essence of the main build for this class. You focus on a lot of crit, you get to low health, and you just do your best to survive while doing loads of damage. Lich doesn't tend to have as much variety between multiple potential different builds, but its main builds is just very well defined. Its damage potential is quite high, but as I was saying before, the risk and reward nature of it becomes a definite bit of a riskier experience until you have the perfect gear built around it in the first place, which is, in my opinion, what definitely makes Necromancer a better choice for this stage of the game for sure, especially considering some aspects of Lich aren't actually bugged currently, and they aren't even providing the damage bonuses that they are supposed to be. Moving on to our second class then, let's talk about the Rogue. And it probably won't surprise many people, if it surprises anyone at all here, to hear that I'm putting Falconer right at the top of Rogue. Where Warlock is arguable and debatable whether or not it's overtuned for a new mastery, Falconer is pretty unashamedly ridiculously strong to start off with, and will almost definitely get a bit of a drop back as a result. The main powerful build that I've seen running with Falconer is a combination of Smoke Bomb and Dive Bomb, the former being a bomb that you throw on the floor to create a destruction, the latter being more literally explosive, even with only being a metaphorical bomb. To put it in more plain terms, the smoke bomb is a utility you throw that shreds armor in an area and also gives smoke blades, which is a buff to melee damage, but also applies to minions to buff the Falcon's damage as well. This also creates shadow clones of yourself all around within the smoke bomb radius. Then with that setup complete, you launch off dive bomb, which can be modified to further shred armor, but even cooler, will also launch secondary little dive bombs from your Falcon, from the Shadow Falcon even, at each of your different shadow clones. And you can make each of these secondary dive bombs also hit a second time if they happen to land within your smoke bomb. So this is all just a giant combo synergy in itself that just does crazy things like one-shotting super late game bosses if you build around it. And the only real thing that you need of note to get it running to begin with is Talons of Valor, a very early game unique that adds flat damage to your Falcon, reduces its cooldowns, and just gives you a bunch of bonus ranks of various important Falconer skills. For our second rogue class then, let's talk about the Bladedancer, your proper thiefy ninja style rogue. And there was some nerfs to this its strongest build in 1.0, but now the strongest thing that I see running around for them tends to be Shadow Cascade focused builds, with the main idea of these being to stack a bunch of shadow clones on top of each other, then pop an AoE off of them that does tons of damage around them to clear all the mobs on your screen, or if you stack them densely enough close to each other, you can actually do quite a lot of single target damage with this too. Overall, this is just more difficult and less damage than the Falconer is in its current stage, though this build in particular doesn't even require a single unique to get started and will still accomplish a hell of a lot, so it is a nice option to have and a nice thing to be aware of too. Then third up for the rogue is the Marksman, your classic proper archer style class in the game, and the main reason that this is just here at the bottom of the mastery rankings for the class is that there just still aren't enough bow subtypes within the game. By that what I mean is implicit affixes are very strong in Last Epoch. These are the affixes that are guaranteed on an item depending on its subtype. Melee weapons have so many different options that they get specific enough to be things like bonus minion necrotic damage 160%, which is amazing, and because of how specific it is, the actual bonus is again massive. But bows have a very limited number of types and thus are just much harder to find and build around in meaningful ways. They're much less specific, which means their bonuses are just much lower. All that said, the best build that I've seen going around for Marksman regardless of this is Icicle-based detonating arrow, which does look pretty dang cool. The general foundation of the build being detonating arrow spec'd out for as many hits as possible in as little time as you can do them, and the reason for this is combining with the Reign of Winter unique item, which does require level 70, yes, but it makes every bow hit have a chance to spawn an icicle at your target. So the idea is you just load up on detonating arrow with so many multi-hits and then fire it off inside of smoke bombs with shadow clones and just watch the icicles rain down, melting all the enemies inside, which is pretty damn cool in its own right too, even if it is the weakest rogue mastery. Then let's move on to Mage, and far and away at the top of it is Runemaster. This was another recently added mastery to the game not too long before 1.0 release, honestly, and it is insanely strong, but also deservedly so because it involves the whole runic invocation system, which requires you to enter combos of inputs and use specific spells to access other spells. And honestly, once you have a proper build worked out, it isn't as complex as it sounds by any means. There isn't a whole lot of memory involved, it's just a high actions per minute type of playstyle compared to most masteries, but the damage that it can reach is definitely deserving of that extra cost. The build that I want to recommend for this mastery right now is called Infinite Frost, which lets you do really solid damage, but it's also just an absolutely insane tank, able to generate thousands and thousands of ward as you run through an area or fight off a boss. To put this one simply, you are essentially immortal to anything short of being hit for about 6,000 damage, which will only happen if you stand in a telegraph from a super high-end boss, so the defense is absolutely on point, but then the offense is still pretty damn solid in its own right, quite impressively being almost automatic the way that the build is made as well. Essentially, you just teleport around the place while ice shards just fire off around you, killing all the enemies that are there and generating insane amounts of ward for your safety, while you again are just teleporting through the area really dang quickly. It's simple, it's strong, it's pretty damn unstoppable, and if you want to use this for yourself, we've got a guide for this already up on the channel that you can check out yourself. After that, we have the Spellblade mastery in second place. This one is pretty fun, honestly. I love a good battle mage archetype myself, and the build that I really enjoy watching people use on this one is focused around Flame Reave, a sort of lunging sword strike that fires off a flame wall from it, and the idea of making a build completely focused around buffing this attack, which can actually get pretty nutty strong at some points too. And so you essentially just become this melee mage focusing your own power before releasing it in larger blasts from the tip of your sword as a catalyst, which is a really cool concept in itself. Then finally we have have the Sorcerer, and honestly, Sorcerer is just a bit downtrodden due to the existence of Runemaster in the first place. Runemaster is essentially more complex, harder to play Sorcerer, but also just sort of does everything Sorcerer can, but better as a result. More damage, more tankiness. That said, if you want to be a crazy spellcaster in animations and in concept, and are willing to take an effectiveness loss to have your life be a touch less complex, less inputs, let's say you have less hand mobility and you want less buttons to press every minute, Sorcerer still fits the bill pretty well, with most if not all builds though being focused around variations of the Black Hole and Meteor skills. Black Hole being a massive gravity well pulling enemies together, and you can even specialize this to launch meteors on its own. But then of course you have the Manual Meteor, which is just a massive high mana cost large pop of damage that you can customize however you like, sometimes even making it a lightning damage meteor, which conceptually is pretty cool too. The thing is, I find it really hard to recommend this mastery, even for people who do want an easier time when things like the Infinite Frost Runemaster build exist, because you saw the gameplay. There is barely any inputs required really. It's high damage and near immortal, all while being an elementally focused spellcaster, which is exactly the niche that Sorcerer is also trying to fill as a mastery. So I don't really know what to say about this one. I think it needs a rework just as a way as some other ones to do that we will be talking about later. Then let's move on to the Primalist base class, and the race for best mastery here is much closer than most classes are, but in first I'm putting Druid just because of the heights that I've seen it reach. This mastery has access to bear form, which is fun and can make some pretty strong builds. Spriggan form, which is definitely interesting, but most notably is Swarm Blade form, turning you into an insect with blade arms. Chain this together with a tornado that follows you around doing elemental damage, and you have one of the stronger builds in the game as a whole, moving around extremely quickly, dishing out tons of damage right around your actual player itself. It's very powerful, extremely cool looking, and I'm definitely just a big fan of this one if you like the class fantasy of it. Speaking of class fantasy though, what about one with companionship? Because next up we have the Beastmaster, which does generally what it says on the tin. You get access to a load of companion skills, they interact with your own attacks too and can be buffed by them. You can put everything into making a singular companion extremely strong, or instead build a horde of different ones together. And my personal favorite way that I've seen Beastmaster done, which was nerfed a bit but is still great in 1.0, is squirrels. Because this is a summon wolves build with high crit and crit multipliers, but once you get far enough into the game, there is a unique that changes wolf summons into squirrels and makes them extra powerful, and I just love this both conceptually and the fact that something so silly is actually as strong as it is as well. Then the final Primalist mastery that we're talking about is going to be Shaman. I don't think this is a bad mastery on the general overall of things, but I do think as a whole, Primalist sort of holds up the mid slot of the classes, not having any of the top 3 strongest masteries, but also none of the bottom ones either. So Shaman is the weakest Primalist mastery, but still very solid on the whole, and there are 2 main builds that I've seen really pop off for Shaman, one based around Thorn Totems, which I think is really fun, but the much more visually exciting and probably more effective one are the Lightning builds, focused around the special Super Lightning Totems that you can get through these specialization points on the actual Lightning Totem tree that does double damage and covers a massive radius, and it genuinely just looks so cool in action as well. Then we move on to our final base class of the day, which is the Sentinel, and we of course have to start this one off at the top with Paladin, which is by far and away the best mastery for the class right now, especially with the addition of Healing Hands in 1.0. Whether you build around Healing Hands as your main skill, or instead make it passively activate on its own when you hit with a melee attack, which is really strong too, Healing Hands is insanely important and is a part of most Paladin builds now, even extending to being part of non-Paladin builds too, which do build around it if they can. It's just a firm part of the class. The one build that I specifically recommend right now for Paladin is essentially Judgment-focused Paladin, which we have a guide for here on the channel. The main idea being this is specializing around Judgment as a skill so that it can dump all of your mana into a ridiculously high damage singular Judgment, but then turning Judgment into an aura around you that lasts for a few seconds, dealing high damage in an area. Pair that with the Volatile Reversal skill, the first one unlocked for Void Knight, to rewind time by 2 seconds and get all of your mana back. Then you're using your movement skills to get back into the action with this aura still on you from before, dealing high damage just around you. Generally speaking, this starts out from a Holy Trail style build in lower levels, and Holy Trail stays a part of it in the full version too, just for more damage and to buff the Judgment itself. But it's just a very coherent build with minimal changes from the early game leveling version to the end game version if you build it up right, and it's quite strong, enjoyable, and just beautiful looking as well. Then second up for the class, we have the Void Knight. This is one of my favorite class fantasies in the game. Big, evil, shadowy, dark knight, focused on void damage in the void itself, and while it has received many nerfs in the past, it is still in a decent enough spot in 1.0, with my personal favorite build that I've seen going around for this being 100% crit, Void Cleave, and Erasing Strike. Void Cleave as your more sort of moment-to-moment usage ability, and Erasing Strike is a giant bomb of damage that looks gnarly when you use it, and literally will delete enemies from existence if it happens to kill them. It's not as offensively strong as Paladin is, it's not as survivable either, but it is still quite solid in in its own right. Then the final mastery of the day as a whole, let's talk about the Forge Guard. Poor little Forge Guard. Defensively, Forge Guard can actually accomplish a hell of a lot, becoming an absolute unit of a tank, but offensively, it just has such a massive lack of damage capability and synergy compared to most other masteries. It's definitely a very fun concept, a cool idea of a class, but it is in heavy need of a rework as a mastery, as the developers themselves have said in the past. That said, the build that I recommend that you'd use if you do go for Forge Guard is just the Army of Minions build, as that's the only really viable thing that they have currently. Honestly, this build focuses around Manifest Armor and Forge Strike to make sets of living armor that copy your equipment stats, and also giant cleaving floating axes to take out these smaller enemies. Also diving into both Void Cleave from the base class abilities, as well as Healing Hands from Paladin, just for its insane utility. But again, on the whole, this one is just sort of simply the weakest mastery for the class. That just about does it for today then, everyone. A build recommendation for every mastery in the game, whether you just want to change things up a little bit or if you're looking to try out a whole new mastery entirely, as well as ranking the masteries within their individual base classes too, as far as the current balance of everything goes. I hope you've enjoyed this video then, and hopefully it helps you out in some way. And of course, if there are any builds that you are a particularly big fan of, feel free to mention them down in the comments below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.